Hello, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. So will South Africa join the Six Nations, or should South Africa join the Six Nations? That might be a better question for me to ask in this video. I was at the Six Nations launch today, actually, that took place in London, which was quite interesting. But once again, one of the questions which was asked to the Chief Executive of Six Nations, Ben Morrell, was about South Africa and their potential participation in the Six Nations. So if you're new here, do subscribe to the channel, like the video, and drop a comment down below on your view. It's the sort of subject which really gets people debating. People have a lot of strong opinions on it. So do drop a comment down below. I'm going to go into kind of what the state of play is at the moment in terms of South Africa and the Six Nations. Doesn't look like it's on the table at the moment, but I'll go through sort of the pros and cons and then give my own view. And most importantly, let me know what you think about this issue, as I already say. All right, let's get into it. So as I say, at the Six Nations launch today in London, Ben Morrell, the chief executive, he was actually speaking to the Ruck podcast from the Times. So you'll be able to hear that full interview on the latest episode of the Ruck, wherever you get your podcast from. But he basically got asked by Will Kelleher about the South Africa joining the Six Nations. This is one of those subjects which rears its head every so often. It's kind of on the horizon. Some people expect it to happen because we've seen more of the alignment of the domestic game in South Africa with the Northern Hemisphere. So for a lot of people, the next step would be South Africa to join the Six Nations. But the chief executive, Ben Morrell, basically said, no, that's not on the table. He also spoke about as a championship, the Six Nations isn't looking to expand. They're not looking to change the format of it. So that would also not be looking at introducing any sort of promotion relegation in terms of Italy and Georgia and those sorts of discussions which take place as well, which is always an interesting topic of debate of the Six Nations, because on the one hand, people want to see Georgia given an opportunity. But what does that mean for the format of what I think is undeniably the best, certainly the best rugby competition to happen annually outside of a World Cup? I think it is probably the best, maybe even better than a World Cup for a lot of people in terms of the passion and history of that tournament. But part of that conversation is South Africa joining. So at this moment in time, it doesn't look like it is going to happen. I'm going to go through the arguments for that and why it kind of makes sense, and also the arguments against it. I think there are two pretty reasonable sides to this debate. So most importantly, actually, in this video, do let me know what you think down below. I've had people, particularly Springbok fans on the channel, comment before. I perhaps naively thought that Springbok fans would really want to be part of the Six Nations. It's such a great product to be part of it. In terms of a cash cow, it's a competition which makes a hell of a lot more money than the Rugby Championship. So from a financial point of view for South Africa, it would be a good thing to be involved in. But I had a lot of Springbok fans on previous videos I've done about this saying that they don't want to lose that rivalry with the All Blacks and what the Rugby Championship gives them. So actually they wouldn't want to join the Six Nations. So Springbok fans, fans of the Northern Hemisphere teams, do let me know in the comments down below where you fall on this issue. But I want to go through the arguments for, first of all, which I think, if we start about it, if you think about the Springboks joining the Six Nations, it immediately makes the competition more competitive. The Springboks are so good. They're such a good rugby nation. They're a real challenge as well, I think, for a lot of the Northern Hemisphere teams in the way in which they approach the game. Their physicality is something which I think we've seen teams struggle with on a lot of occasions. I know Ireland and France beat them in the most recent autumn, but those were close games away from home for South Africa, who had some injuries as well. So in terms of the competition of the Six Nations, South Africa being in it automatically makes it a lot more competitive. Also from a financial point of view, in terms of SARU, the South Africa, New Zealand, Australian rugby unions, and that arrangement and the Rugby Championship, financially, South Africa is bringing a huge chunk of that money to the table in terms of interest commercially and also TV rights. So if they were bringing that to the Six Nations on both of those things, commercial and TV rights, it's a much more valuable product as well if you're looking at the finances of it. And it's always something we're talking about in terms of rugby and the stricken finances of the game. From a Northern Hemisphere perspective, financially having South Africa part of the competition probably would be better from my financial point of view. And in terms of time difference as well, I'm going to get on to the travel. That's coming in the negative reasons for South Africa being part of the Six Nations. But purely in terms of time difference from a South African perspective, it makes a lot more sense to be part of a Northern Hemisphere competition than it does with the Southern Hemisphere, where they're having to jump between time zones all the time. It makes it really, really difficult. And that's part of the reason that we've seen the South African domestic sides be integrated into the Northern Hemisphere, into the URC. That's kind of a transition that has already happened. And because of that, it would make sense then for the national side, the international side, to then be part of the Six Nations and be fully aligned with the Northern Hemisphere calendar. Because at the moment, they've got their domestic game aligned with it, but then internationally, they're still aligned with the Southern Hemisphere. And that actually, for the Springboks, is quite a difficult thing to try and balance. Players that are regular Springboks are basically playing all year round at the moment. They get very, very little time off. So again, being part of that Northern Hemisphere, not having the Rugby Championship would make sense from that point of view. But there are also a lot of arguments against it. And I mentioned one of them there, just in terms of the travel. You think about the Six Nations, and one of the best things about it is how close all the nations are together. From London, where I live, you can hop on a train and get yourself to Paris if England are playing at the Stade de France. You can jump on a pretty short, relatively cheap flight to Rome to go and watch them in Italy. Same to get up to Edinburgh, to Cardiff and to Dublin. The proximity of the competition from a fan's perspective is just awesome. And also I think the proximity of the countries for the natural rivalries is what makes it so good as well. If you head up to Edinburgh for a game at Murrayfield, if you head to any of those places that I mentioned just a moment ago, it's because of the proximity, the amount of fans that can go, the event it is around that. All of a sudden, for the Northern Hemisphere sides, if they're having to make the journey down to South Africa, don't get me wrong, I know in South Africa, it would be a huge deal. Those internationals would be packed out, it would be brilliant. But in terms of having that real mix of a fan base, I'm just not sure you would quite have it in the same way that you currently do at the moment. And that kind of links to the history of the competition, right? The Six Nations is as good as it is. I said at the top of the video, I think it's certainly probably the best rugby competition in the world because of the history of that competition. And it has been the Five Nations before and it changed to six. So it's not saying it can't change, but I think changing from five to make it six and invite Italy in is very different from changing where it is now to invite South Africa is in. I think it would really change the feel of that competition. Also, if South Africa were to join the Six Nations, what then happens to the autumn? Because I don't think you could have them as part of the Six Nations and them then still playing those sides in the autumn again. So that whole situation I think would be quite different and would look really, really different. And then also something I mentioned at the top of the chat as well about the amount of South African fans on this channel who said they don't want to lose that rivalry with the All Blacks, which I thought was really interesting. They wouldn't want to be part of the Six Nations because they want those guaranteed games against the All Blacks in the Rugby Championship, the competition they know and that they love so much, and they have that rivalry in there. So maybe from a South African point of view, they wouldn't want to lose that. Maybe that would be a negative thing. As I've said already, do let me know in the comments down below. So that kind of gets me on to my conclusion and my view overall. I think at the moment it is better that the Six Nations stays as it is. But what Ben Morel, the Six Nations chief executive, the outgoing Six Nations chief executive, actually, because he is coming to the end of his tenure in that role, but what he said at the Six Nations launch today was that they have to get the global calendar sorted. And that's kind of where I am on this. The Six Nations doesn't need to change, but rugby needs to change in terms of that global calendar. And that's lining up the domestic games and the international games, all the different unions, all the different stakeholders, the owners of the club, Premiership Rugby, the URC. It is a huge task, but rugby needs to get that lined up so that we have a more consistent and a more coherent global calendar. And then we will still see on a regular basis an international calendar, I think, that works for everyone. And it's not just the Six Nations unions that have this real pot of gold of the Six Nations, which makes a hell of a lot more money than everything else. I think it will hopefully become fairer. Hopefully the so-called second tier teams will then start to get more game time against the tier one nations. So really, rather than it being about whether South Africa join the Six Nations or not, I think it's about that global calendar and getting that right. But that's my thoughts on the matter. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Should South Africa join the Six Nations, or is it more about the global calendar, like I say? All right, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Like the video, drop a comment, and I'll see you in the next one. Nice one.